So Django is a web application that's comprised of a bunch of apps. Yep, that's the naming convention that Django has. It's a web application with sub-apps that just build up the bigger thing. I think of it more in terms of components, right? So Django has a bunch of sub-components that make up the web app or the app itself. But that's not how Django actually is named. It's named by apps. So inside of settings.py, we'll see that we have this section called installed apps. So these are the things that are activated by default with Django. And these apps actually work with our database in many ways. Sometimes they don't, but like the auth app absolutely does, right? So when we made our views and we did stuff like request users authenticated, or even our register view, and we created a user, all of that stuff was dealing with that auth app, and it was actually storing some data in the database. So we want to do that as well. We want our own app that handles all this stuff, and I just call this section products component because I want you to think of it more as a component than an app like the app that you install on your phone or your computer. So let's think of it that way in terms of how it actually functions. It's a piece of the greater whole, as in a component of the greater whole. So we're going to go ahead and actually create this products app or products component. So we're going to go ahead and open up our terminal, and I'm actually not activated right now, so this is a good time for a view. So if I list things out, I can cd into dev, and then I can cd into e-commerce, and then I can do source bin/activate. So I've activated the virtual environment, and I can cd into source again, and what do you know? I'm back. Okay, so to create an app, it's really easy. We just run python manage.py start app. This is the command to create any of your components. And then you're going to name it whatever you'd like. Now, I would say that you probably shouldn't name it anything that's built into Django, or make it something just super weird and long, right? You're going to find a sweet spot. And the best way to learn about how to name these things is really to, number one, you can look at our GitHub repository. So joincfe.com/GitHub. You can look at all of our Django projects there and see how we name things. Or you can look at any Django project on GitHub and get an idea of how they name their apps. But for us, we're going to go with just products because that makes sense. So if I hit enter, it actually creates some code for me right in here. By default, that's what happens. So even if I created another one, I'm actually going to delete this after I create it. But if I did something like cart, it will create that for me too. It creates all sorts of stuff, which we'll go over in just a little bit. But I'm going to go ahead and delete this new one because I definitely don't want that yet. I mean, we will get to it, but I don't want it yet. So what is it that an app does? Well, an app actually handles one thing and one thing well, right? So if you look at Django contrib.auth, that handles pretty much everything related to a user, right? It handles the user model itself. It handles login and log out, and it handles a lot of other things as well. But the main thing there is it does one thing really well, and that's how we want to look at our apps. Every single app is a component. It's a piece of the whole, so you're going to want to make it do one thing really well. If it starts to get really big, that is, if all the code inside that app starts to get really big, you're going to want to separate it out and make it into something different. For example, inside of products, this app, we're going to have a single product, and then you might even have a product category, right? So the product exists inside of a category. In some cases, you might be able to just leave that in the product app. But if you start to get really complex categories, you might want to pull that out of the product app and put it in its own app of categories. That's a very simple example of that. But you're going to learn a lot more about how we use apps going forward. I just want to get you a little understanding of how these things work so we have better going forward. If you have any questions, let us know. Otherwise, let's keep going.